equals 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 equals. The fluorescent light above my desk had been flickering for 11 months. I know it was 11 months because I submitted the maintenance request the same week my father signed the Vanguard contract, the one that saved his company, and the bulb was still stuttering the night I finally decided I was done. That cubicle was 5 feet wide and maybe 6 feet deep. It smelled like burned coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, the kind of chemical sweetness that coats the back of your throat after a long enough time. I had been sitting in that cubicle on the 3rd floor of Sterling Supply Chain headquarters in Chicago for 14 years. I was 34 years old. I had given that company the best thinking I had, the sharpest years of my life, the kind of sustained focus that most people save for the things they love. My name is David Sterling. I know what that name sounds like. Yes, that's Sterling. People who meet me for the first time make a predictable set of assumptions. They assume I am comfortable, that the last name bought me something easy. What they do not see is the 3rd floor cubicle. What they do not know is that for 14 years, every significant technological leap this company made came from a desk that did not even have a window. Let me tell you what Sterling Supply Chain actually was. My father, Arthur Sterling, founded it in 1987. He was a logistics man, old school, the kind of executive who valued a firm handshake on a golf course more than anything written in a contract. By the time I joined the company at 20, SSC was a mid-sized operation moving industrial parts across the Midwest. Solid, respectable, not remarkable. I was a systems engineer. I built algorithms, routing logic, load optimization, cost reduction models. The language of supply chain efficiency, which sounds dry until you understand that a single percentage point of cost reduction on a $100 million contract is $1 million. I understood that. I had always understood that. My younger brother Julian did not understand that. Julian had a business degree from a school our father paid for, a custom-tailored suit for every day of the week, and a corner office on the 8th floor with an Italian espresso machine. Julian had the handshake. Julian had the smile. Julian had what my father called natural leadership ability, which I eventually came to understand meant the ability to take credit for other people's work without feeling a moment of shame. For 8 months in 2019, I barely left the building. I ate cold soup from a can at my desk. I slept 4 hours a night on a good week. I was building something I called Project Zenith, a routing engine that could dynamically remap delivery networks in real time, reducing waste, cutting fuel costs, shaving margins that most companies would consider impossible to touch. The core of Zenith was built on an algorithm I had first sketched out in a spiral notebook in 2009, before I ever signed an employment contract with SSC. That notebook sat in the bottom drawer of my desk. I never thought much about it back then. I assumed results were enough. I assumed the work would speak for itself. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but the first one. Project Zenith cut Vanguard Manufacturing's logistics costs by 45%. Vanguard was SSC's largest client, responsible for 31% of total company revenue. When Vanguard's procurement team had begun shopping around for alternatives a year prior, there had been real fear in this building. The kind of fear that makes executives go quiet in meetings and start talking about restructuring. Zenith locked Vanguard in for 7 more years. It was the single most valuable piece of work this company had ever produced. My father knew that. He absolutely knew that. The morning after I delivered the final Zenith build, I came into the office at my usual time, 6:45, coffee already cooling in my hand. There was a company-wide email waiting for me. Gold background, SSC letterhead, the kind of formatting reserved for major announcements. It was an invitation to a celebration dinner at the Langham Hotel, 3 weeks out. Black tie. The subject line read, "Celebrating the Vanguard partnership and the vision of Julian Sterling." I read it twice. I set my coffee down on the desk. I looked at that flickering light above my head for a long moment. Then I opened the bottom drawer, took out the spiral notebook from 2009, and placed it on top of my keyboard. I did not touch it for 3 more weeks, but I did not put it back either. There is something I want you to understand about that moment, about why I did not explode or storm upstairs or fire off an angry reply to that email. I had spent 14 years in a system that rewarded my silence. Not just rewarded it, required it. My father had built an entire operation on the assumption that I would always be there, always deliver, and always accept whatever version of recognition he chose to give me. My silence was not weakness. It was a habit I had trained into myself so deeply that I did not yet know how to break it. But I kept the notebook on my desk, and I did not put it back. To understand the full scope of what my father was, you need to know about the house in Westfield. 4 years before the Vanguard celebration dinner, I had found a property in the western suburbs. Old colonial, built in the 1940s, bones still solid but everything else in serious disrepair. Cracked plaster walls, warped hardwood floors, a kitchen that had not been updated since Gerald Ford was president. I paid below market for it and spent every weekend for 2 years doing the restoration myself. Not because I could not afford to hire someone, but because I wanted to. I wanted to know that house. I wanted the kind of ownership that lives in your hands, not just in a deed. I sanded those floors myself, board by board, on my hands and knees on Saturday mornings while the rest of the neighborhood slept. I patched the plaster with my own mix, learning the technique from YouTube videos and a library book on historic restoration. I retiled the bathroom. I rebuilt the kitchen cabinets. I planted a small garden in the back where the previous owner had let weeds take over completely. I had a woman I was seeing at the time, and we talked about the future the way people talk about it when they mean it, in specifics, in room assignments, in paint colors chosen and then reconsidered. The house was finished in the spring of 2018. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever built with my own hands. My father called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon in June of that year. He was behind his mahogany desk, the one imported from somewhere that impressed people who cared about imported furniture. He did not invite me to sit down. He told me that Julian was getting married. He told me that Julian needed a property befitting his new position as Vice President of Business Development, a title my father had created specifically to give Julian something official to put on a business card. He told me that the Westfield property, which had been purchased originally through a fund my grandfather established and which my father controlled as trustee, was going to be transferred to Julian as a wedding gift. He said, "Julian needs a face that matches his title. You live in a server room, David. What do you need a 4-bedroom house for?" I remember the particular quality of light in that office. Afternoon sun coming through tinted glass. Everything bathed in the kind of amber that makes wealthy rooms look like oil paintings. I remember the sound of the air conditioning, low and constant. I remember the way my father did not look at me while he said it. He was reviewing some document on his desk, turning pages, as if what he was telling me was an administrative footnote. I lost the house. I moved into a rental apartment 15 minutes from the office, on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old cooking and parking garage. I told myself that I would earn it back. I told myself that Vanguard would change everything. That when I delivered results at the scale of Project Zenith, my father would have to acknowledge what I had built, what I was worth, what I deserved. I want to tell you that I fought back in that office. I want to tell you I stood up and said every righteous thing that was racing through my mind. But I did not. I nodded. I said I understood. I walked back to my cubicle on the 3rd floor and worked until midnight. That was the habit. That was the trap I had built for myself, one silent agreement at a time. Looking back now, I can see that my father made his second critical error in that office. The first error had been years earlier, when he never bothered to secure the intellectual property that underpinned his company's most important technology. That error came from arrogance, from the assumption that a son was property, that loyalty was a given and gratitude was not owed. The second error was taking the house, because taking the house was personal in a way that a business slight is not. Taking the house taught me that there was no floor, There was no point at which my father would stop and say, "This is enough, he has given enough, he deserves to keep this one thing." There was no line. When you understand that there is no line, your thinking changes. I did not know that yet, fully, but the knowledge was coming. It was building the way weather builds, pressure that has no visible form until the moment it does. The Langham Hotel ballroom seats 400. That night they had it set for 220. Round tables with white linen and centerpieces that cost more than my monthly rent. I found my place card after 10 minutes of searching. Table 14. Which sounds fine until you understand that the tables were numbered outward from the podium, and table 14 was in the back corner near the service entrance, close enough that I could hear the kitchen staff talking through the door. I was wearing the best suit I owned. Navy wool, off the rack from a department store on Michigan Avenue, dry cleaned that week. Fit me well enough. Julian was wearing a tuxedo that had been cut for his specific body, the kind of tailoring that costs $5,000 and makes every other garment in the room look like a costume. He was working the floor like a campaign event, hand on every shoulder, laugh prepared and deployed at precise intervals. He was very good at it. I will give him that. My father took the podium at 9 o'clock. The room went quiet. Arthur Sterling in a room was a gravitational event. He was 62 years old, and he carried himself like a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be the most important person present. Salt and pepper hair, perfectly cut. Voice that filled a room without effort. He spoke for 12 minutes. I counted. He talked about the founding of SSC, the early years, the philosophy of leadership that had guided every major decision. He talked about the Vanguard partnership as the crowning achievement of the company's history. He talked about vision and boldness and the courage to believe in people. Every single word of those 12 minutes was about Julian. Julian's foresight. Julian's relationship management. Julian's ability to inspire confidence in Vanguard's leadership team. Julian, who, as best I could account for, had attended 3 dinners with Vanguard executives over the previous 8 months, while I had been in my cubicle rewriting routing logic at 2 in the morning. The applause was long and genuine. People believed it. Why would they not believe it? It came from Arthur Sterling, and Arthur Sterling had made a lot of people a lot of money over the years, and that kind of track record buys a great deal of credibility in a ballroom. Then my father paused, and he looked out across the room, and he gestured in the general direction of my corner. "And of course," he said, his voice carrying that particular warmth reserved for afterthoughts, "let's give a hand to our IT and logistics support teams, fellows like David back there, who keep the networks running and the servers humming. Good work, boys." Someone near me started clapping. Polite, brief, the kind of applause that fills silence without meaning anything. I smiled. I held the smile exactly long enough. Then I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip and looked at nothing in particular. The woman to my left, someone's wife who I had never met, gave me a look that I recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who has just witnessed something slightly embarrassing and is uncertain whether to acknowledge it. Pity, lightly applied. I returned her look with the most neutral expression I could produce, and she turned back to her table companions, and that was the end of that. What I felt in that moment is difficult to describe honestly. There was a version of it that was simply pain, the clean, bright pain of being publicly diminished in a room full of people who would remember it. But underneath that was something else, something colder and more specific. It was the sensation of a belief finally dying. For 14 years I had operated on the assumption that my father, at some fundamental level, saw me, saw the work, even if he did not always say it. Even if the recognition was always deferred, always promised implicitly for some future moment when the time was right. I had believed, without ever fully examining the belief, that he knew. That night I understood that he did not know, or that he did know and had decided it did not matter. And I could not determine which of those 2 possibilities was worse. I felt a hand on my elbow about 20 minutes later, just as the dessert course was being cleared. Evelyn Vance. She was senior project manager on the Zenith implementation, the person who had coordinated every handoff between my engineering work and the client-facing delivery team. She was 41, sharp, and had worked at SSC long enough to have no illusions about how it operated. She leaned close enough that her voice was under the ambient noise of the room. "Walk with me," she said. We stepped into the corridor outside the ballroom, where the carpet was thick and the chandeliers made everything look expensive. Evelyn stood with her arms crossed and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. "You built Zenith," she said. It was not a question. "The team built Zenith," I said. "It was automatic." She shook her head slowly. "You did the core work. I know the sequence. I managed the handoffs. David, you handed them this contract on a silver platter. You saved this company." And he just stood up in front of 200 people and told them you keep the networks humming. She paused. "You look like you are deciding whether to be angry or whether to let it go. I want you to understand something. If you let this go, it will happen again. It has already happened again. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I looked at her. She looked back. The chandelier above us made a soft, steady hum. "I hear you," I said. She nodded once. "Good," she said. "Because I have been watching this place for 11 years, and I have never once seen a man get what he was owed by staying quiet." She went back into the ballroom. I stood in the corridor for a while longer, alone, the hum of the chandelier the only sound. Then I went home. The Monday after the Langham dinner, I arrived at my desk at 6:45 to find a meeting invitation for 9 o'clock with my father and Julian. No agenda. Those are the meetings you dread. My father's office on the 8th floor was a different world from the 3rd. The carpet was thick and dark, the kind your shoes sink into slightly. The windows looked north across the Chicago skyline, Lake Michigan visible on clear days as a flat gray line at the edge of everything. Julian was already there when I arrived, sitting on the edge of the leather couch with his jacket off, jacket draped perfectly over the armrest. My father was at his desk. He did not stand. "We are going to be making some structural changes," my father said. He had a folder open in front of him that he did not look at. "The Vanguard contract is in client management now. Julian's team. What that means for the technical side is that the heavy lifting is done. We need you to shift focus to infrastructure maintenance. System reliability, server uptime, that category of work." I sat with that for 3 full seconds before I responded. "You are moving me off Zenith development," I said. "Zenith is deployed," Julian said. He had the easy confidence of someone who has never had to prove anything. "The build is done. What's left is operations." My father nodded. "It makes sense to realign resources. You are our best infrastructure man. We need that skill set focused on keeping what we have running." He finally looked up at me. "This is a good thing, David. Stability." I understood what was happening. I had seen it in the days since the dinner, in the way certain colleagues avoided my eyes in the hallway, in a message from a project coordinator asking whether I was available for a maintenance review that would previously never have come to my level. My father had recognized that I was unhappy, and his solution was not to address the source of that unhappiness. His solution was to remove me from anything important enough to cause further conflict. He was putting me in a box, a smaller, quieter box where I could do no harm to the version of this company's story he was constructing. "There is also the matter of system access," Julian added almost casually. "Since you are shifting to infrastructure, we are going to reconfigure your server permissions. You will have full access to the maintenance stack. The Zenith production environment will be restricted to client management going forward." They were cutting me off from my own work. I looked at my father. His expression was patient and final, the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is now simply managing the communication of it. He expected me to nod. I had always nodded. "How much notice before the access changes?" I asked. "End of week," Julian said. "That gives me enough time to document the handoff properly," I said. "I want to make sure the transition is clean." My father's posture eased slightly. That was the nod he was waiting for. The compliance signal. "Everything is fine. David is fine. David is always fine." "Good," he said. "That is what I expected from you." I walked back to my cubicle. I sat down. I opened my bottom drawer. I took out the spiral notebook and I looked at the date on the inside cover. January 14th, 2009. 3 months before I signed my employment contract with SSC. Then I did something I had never done before. I opened a new browser window, typed in the name of an intellectual property attorney, and started reading. The core algorithm in that notebook, the routing logic that had become the engine of Project Zenith, had been developed entirely on my own time, on my own equipment, before I was an employee of this company. I had never assigned those rights to SSC. There was no IP assignment agreement in my employment contract because my father, the man who built his empire on handshakes instead of paperwork, had never bothered to ask for one. He had assumed I was his. He had assumed that a son was the same as an asset, that love and obligation meant the same thing as a legal transfer of rights. He had assumed for 14 years, and every year I had let him assume, and every year the assumption had grown larger and more entrenched, and now it had grown large enough that he was comfortable standing in a hotel ballroom in front of 200 people and reducing me to a Wi-Fi technician. I closed the browser. I put the notebook back in the drawer. I answered 3 infrastructure maintenance emails with complete professionalism, and I began to count days. 6 weeks after my demotion, I made an appointment with my father's assistant and put 60 pages on his desk. The folder was bound, tabbed, printed on heavy stock. It contained 14 years of documented contributions. Every algorithm I had built, every cost reduction I had engineered, every project where my work had been the deciding technical factor. It included salary comparisons pulled from industry databases showing that my compensation had been running 23% below market rate for an engineer at my experience level for a decade. It included a formal request for the title of Chief Technology Officer, compensation adjusted to market standard, and 18% equity in the company. Julian was in the office when I arrived. He was on the couch again. I had begun to understand that the couch was Julian's preferred position for watching things unfold. My father looked at the folder. He did not open it. He turned his pen over in his fingers a few times, end over end, a habit I had watched for 30 years. 18%, he said. Based on my documented contribution to company value over 14 years, 18% is a conservative figure, I said. I am prepared to walk through the analysis in detail. He set the pen down. Then he laughed. It started as a short exhale, almost dismissive, and then it built. Full, genuine laughter, the kind that comes from a place of real amusement. Julian looked at the floor for a moment and then he started quieter, a smirking kind of laughter that he seemed to be trying to manage. My father leaned back in his chair. "David," he said when he had gathered himself, "let me explain something to you that you apparently have not understood in 14 years of working here." He picked up the pen again. "I have a man who services my car. Brilliant mechanic. Best in the city, probably. He keeps that car running better than the dealer ever could. I would be lost without him." He paused. "But I do not give him 18% of my business. He fixes the car. When it runs, he gets paid. That is the arrangement." Julian was watching me now. "You are a magnificent mechanic, David," my father continued. "But I do not give equity in a $500 million company to a mechanic. If you believe your skills are worth more somewhere else, that door has always been open to you." There was a long silence. Outside the window, a plane was crossing the northern sky, tiny and slow. "Thank you for your time," I said. I stood up. I left the folder on his desk. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and rode down in silence. In the lobby, I walked past the front desk, through the revolving door, out onto the sidewalk, where the late October wind was coming off the lake with enough force to make people lean into it. I stood on the pavement for 90 seconds, hands in my coat pockets. Then I went back inside. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop. I want to be honest about what I felt in that elevator. Because it was not anger, not in the way you might expect. Anger would have been a kind of warmth. What I felt was the opposite of warmth. It was a long, clarifying cold, The kind that comes when the last piece of a very large question finally becomes an answer. I had been asking, in various forms, for 14 years. Does he see me? And now I had the answer, stated plainly, without the soft edges of ambiguity that had kept me in place all this time. He saw me perfectly. He had always seen me. He had simply decided that what he saw was worth exactly what he had been paying for it, and not $1 more. You cannot negotiate with a person who has already told you exactly who they are. You can only decide what you are going to do with the information. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the browser. I navigated to the website of Rebecca Choi, intellectual property attorney, downtown Chicago. I had been reading her work for 6 weeks. I clicked the contact form and I wrote 6 sentences, concise and specific, and I hit send. She called me back within 4 hours. What my father did not know, sitting in his office with his pen and his laughter and his mechanic metaphor, was that I had spent the previous 6 weeks doing something I should have done 14 years earlier. I had begun building the case. I had pulled every email, every project log, every version control timestamp showing the development of the core Zenith algorithm. I had cross-referenced dates against my employment start date. I had reconstructed the full chain of custody for the intellectual property that was, at this exact moment, running inside the most profitable contract his company had ever signed. He had handed me the door. He just did not know what was on the other side of it. My apartment at that time was a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building on West Adams. The living room had one window that faced a brick wall. There was a water stain on the ceiling above the couch that I had learned to stop noticing. The kitchen was functional, barely. It was not the house in Westfield. It was the apartment that existed because of the house in Westfield. For 6 weeks, I had been using that apartment in ways its previous tenant almost certainly had not. My dining table was covered in printed documents organized by date and category. 3 separate folders, color-coded. Blue for IP development timeline. Green for compensation records and market comparisons. Red for every internal communication related to Project Zenith where credit was attributed to the wrong person. I had also been making phone calls in the evenings, when the office could not track them. One call in particular, 7 days after my meeting with Rebecca Choi, changed the scale of everything. Rebecca was 46, former partner at a major downtown firm who had gone independent 8 years ago after what she described as a fundamental disagreement about client ethics. Her office was in the West Loop, 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building with exposed brick and high ceilings. I met her there on a Thursday morning. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had a habit of tapping her index finger against her thumbnail while she thought. I put the spiral notebook on her desk. I put the file of development logs beside it. She read for 40 minutes while I drank the coffee her assistant had brought and looked at the brick wall opposite her window. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the notebook and looked at me. "Walk me through the employment contract timeline," she said. I did. She asked specific questions. She went back to certain pages in the logs. She asked me to confirm 3 dates. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something on her notepad and turned it so I could read it. IP was never assigned. No work-for-hire clause. No invention assignment agreement. I nodded. This algorithm, as it exists in its foundational form, was developed prior to your employment start date, she said. And the production version deployed in Zenith is, at its core, derivative of that foundational algorithm. Correct, I said. She tapped her thumbnail. David, this is not a negotiating chip. This is the underlying asset of their most profitable contract. If you withdraw the license or assert ownership and demand retroactive royalties, the number we are talking about is not a settlement figure. The number we are talking about is existential. I asked her what she meant by existential. She told me about the Series B. She had done her research in the days between my first call and this meeting. SSC was in active discussions with 2 private equity firms about a capital raise of $120 million. The raise was predicated on SSC's technology portfolio being proprietary and free of third-party claims. If there was an outstanding IP dispute, particularly one of this magnitude, the raise would collapse. The company's valuation, built significantly on Zenith's revenue generation, would be in question. But there is something else, she said. She leaned forward slightly. In a capital raise of this structure, the company submits documentation to potential investors certifying the status of all intellectual property. If they have filed those certifications while knowing there was an unresolved IP ownership question, and there is email evidence that someone inside that company raised the issue and was dismissed, then we are no longer talking about a civil IP dispute. I understood what she was not saying directly. Securities fraud, I said. She said nothing for 3 seconds. Then she said, I think there is someone you need to talk to before we go further. A woman named Sandra Okafor. She was chief financial officer at SSC until about 18 months ago. She was let go under circumstances that I think will be relevant to you. I asked how she knew about Sandra Okafor. Because Sandra reached out to me 14 months ago, Rebecca said. She had concerns about exactly this issue. At the time, she did not have a client with standing to pursue it. Now she does. I sat with that for a moment. The idea that the thread I had finally started pulling had been waiting for me at the end of someone else's unfinished work. Rebecca called Victor Blackwood herself. Not LinkedIn. Rebecca had worked with Victor on a licensing dispute 3 years prior. She told him only that she had a client with a significant IP claim against SSC and that the situation might interest him. Victor called me directly, within 2 hours, from a number with a San Francisco area code. We met 4 days later at Prime and Provisions on West Randolph. He was at the corner table when I arrived, a glass of water and a small leather notebook in front of him. He was 58, heavyset, with the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of making very large decisions. He stood to shake my hand, and his grip was firm without being performative. He had done his homework. He referenced 3 specific SSC technological updates over the past 8 years, each one corresponding to a paper I had published internally, and he named the correlations without me prompting him. He had been watching SSC's technology evolution for years. He had been watching me specifically for at least 4 of them. I put the notebook on the table. I walked him through it. He asked precise questions. Halfway through, he called someone on his cell, spoke for 90 seconds, and then returned his full attention to me. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. My legal team can have a preliminary assessment in 72 hours, he said. But I will tell you what I already know. The routing architecture that Apex has been trying to develop internally for the past 3 years is derivative of the same foundational logic you just showed me. If what you are telling me is accurate, and I believe that it is, then that notebook is the single most valuable document in this city. He refilled my water glass without being asked. What is it that you actually want from this, David? Not the legal outcome. What do you want? I thought about it honestly before I answered. I want to build something, I said. Somewhere that I am not a mechanic. He nodded slowly. I think we can arrange that. Then he said, there is someone I need you to meet first. A woman named Sandra Okafor. She has been waiting for the right moment for a long time. I submitted my resignation on a Tuesday morning, 2 sentences, no explanation. By Tuesday afternoon, my father had called 4 times. I let them all go to voicemail. The first message was reasonable, measured. The second was more insistent. The third had an edge. The fourth began with my full name, which meant he was genuinely alarmed. I called him back Wednesday morning once, briefly. I told him I had accepted a position elsewhere. I told him I wished the company well. He told me I was making a mistake that would follow me for the rest of my professional life. He told me that without the sterling name I would discover exactly what I was actually worth. He used the word ingratitude twice. I said, I appreciate the perspective, Dad. Take care of yourself. And I ended the call. The resignation meeting with SSC's in-house counsel, Craig Whitmore, was scheduled for Thursday. I arrived at conference room B on the 5th floor at 2 in the afternoon. The room smelled like dry erase markers and recycled air. Craig was at the head of the table, suit jacket on, 2 documents in front of him. He was in his mid-50s with careful eyes and the practiced neutrality of a man who had handled many uncomfortable conversations on behalf of people who paid him very well. The first document was a standard departure acknowledgement. The second was a non-compete agreement that would prohibit me from working in logistics technology for any SSC competitor for a period of 36 months.